Well, thank you very much to Brownell Library for hosting this evening's First Wednesday program. Also to Preservation Trust of Vermont for underwriting it. Tonight, I also want to extend a special thanks to Vermont Humanities, not only for including this program in the First Wednesday schedule, but also for providing grant support, not once, but twice over the 3 years of this project, so that we were able to make it as accessible as possible to the public. And that was through a website we developed, a walking tour, and an exhibit. Over the past 3 years, I've had the honor of hearing stories from community members for whom food markets have been central to their lives, whether as customers or as owners or as the children of owners. And what rose to the top for me was this, that for people newly arrived in this country, whether as immigrants or refugees, local markets provide more than familiar food. They are places of connection and social support, and they offer owners and their families a path to economic independence. And this was true in the past, and it continues today. These conversations occurred as part of Historic New England's More Than a Market project, and the foundation of this project was oral histories. So the voices of the people who we spoke to really brought these markets to life, and in fact, they are the authors of this project. So you're going to hear me read their words throughout the program. Let's see, I guess Wendy already covered our contributors. I just wanted to give a special nod to the storytellers, because without them there would be no project. And two people here tonight represent two of the markets we featured. Louis Mossy's grandfather was a co-owner of Danis's Market in the Lakeside neighborhood of Burlington. And Mitch Allen's father actually was a barber, but he liked to hang out at a lot of the different markets, but especially George's Market, which is another one that was part of our project. So these local markets are a source of emotional and physical sustenance, woven into the daily lives of residents. Here, customers can socialize, they can speak in a native language, they can catch up on local and national news, and purchase familiar foods. And of course, technology and transportation have dramatically changed how people shop now and how they socialize, but markets remain an essential business for many immigrant communities, and they did this long before the term was coined during the pandemic. So whether traveling by steamship in 1922 or by plane in 2022, the migration journey embodies both loss and opportunity. Immigrants and refugees leave behind family and friends. They leave behind their professions, money, belongings, traditional social institutions, and an identity rooted in their ancestral lands. And they arrive here with the desire to build a better life for themselves and their families. And these markets can offer a safe place for connection between customers and owners with other people who understand that experience of arriving here. Newcomers can seek practical advice, and they can form bonds through the universal language of food. And owners can realize the desire to run their own businesses after perhaps years of having little control over their lives. So like many urban centers from the mid-1800s to the early 1900s, Burlington and Winooski welcomed waves of immigrants from Eastern and Western Europe seeking a better life in America. And some had fled religious or political persecution or economic disadvantage, and others were just coming here for adventure, or they were following family and friends who'd already settled in this country. And then in the 1990s, Burlington and Winooski welcomed Vietnamese and Bosnian refugees, and today Somali, Bhutanese, Sudanese, Iraqi, Congolese, Afghani, among many other cultures, call this area home. And many of these newer immigrants and refugees are settled here through the Vermont office of the U.S. Committee on Refugees and Immigrants. So there's sort of a different pull here, not that they don't follow family or friends and some of the old factors, but also this now there's the government provides this sort of support. Burlington's location on the eastern shore of Lake Champlain and its position as a major railroad terminus fueled a booming lumber industry, and mills and wood-related factories sprang up along the lake, and beginning in the early 1800s. And then on the other side of the city, along both in Winooski and Burlington, textile mills flourished along the Winooski River. And immigrants provided critical labor for these industries. Irish and French Canadians were the first to arrive beginning in the 1840s, and to work for the railroads, the lumber businesses, and the textile mills. And then Russian, German, Italian, and Lebanese immigrants, along with some smaller ethnic groups, began to arrive in the late 1800s into the early decades of the 1900s. Many immigrants who began as laborers sought financial independence by opening their own businesses, and this often meant that they continued to work as laborers while while also operating their market. And the way they were able to do this was that it was all hands on deck with their families. So families really helped out historically. This is a photograph showing historical markets that we worked with. I'll just going clockwise from the upper left, Izo's Market in Burlington, Chick's Market, Epstein and Melnick, those are both in Winooski, Roy's Market, also in Winooski, Kieslich's Market, which is was in the German community of Burlington, and then Rome's Groceries, which then became J&M Groceries, and that's still around today, Danis's Market in Lakeside, and George's Market. And so in the late 19th and the first half of the 20th century, neighborhood markets were everywhere in Burlington and Winooski. They were on street corners, they were in the middle of blocks. Some people even opened up markets in their living rooms. And before the automobile and refrigeration became widely available, people would shop on a daily basis, and they would shop within blocks of home. So they would stop at the butcher shop, the bakery, confectionery and fruit stands, and the variety food market. And immigrant families owned many of these markets, and they usually lived upstairs, or they would live nearby so that they could serve their customers while still being involved in family life. They worked long hours, but they still had the time to lend a helping hand to neighbors or to lend an ear. And while men were typically listed as the market proprietors in city directories and in the census, women were definitely partners as clerks, bookkeepers, and even butchers. Children helped out as well. They clerked, they stocked shelves, and they delivered to customers. Now, since the 1980s, immigrants from Vietnam, Bosnia, Bhutan, and Eastern and Western Africa have carried on this entrepreneurial tradition, and some in the same neighborhoods or even the same storefronts, but more and more in outlying suburbs where new Americans are settling because that's where the housing is available. They offer staples, spices, seafood, halal meat, and grains that are important to the many cultures that call this area home. And there is actually a lot of overlap in terms of the spices and a lot of the tropical fruits and vegetables in these markets between, say, Asian and African cuisine. And these markets are also a magnet for the growing number of people who like to cook and sample global cuisine. These 6 markets were the contemporary markets we featured in our project. Starting on the upper left, going clockwise, RGS Nepali Market, which is a Bhutanese Nepali market. M Square, Vermont, owned by a Congolese man, not an international market, which is Iraqi, has a lot of African customers as well. Thai Fat Market, which is Vietnamese, one of the earliest, if not the earliest Vietnamese market in the state. Halal Champlain Market, which is owned by a Somali family, and then Euro Market, which is owned by a Bosnian man and serves Eastern European customers. Markets provide immigrants with the foods that connect them to memories of their homeland, their traditions, and also to their cultural community in a new country. Goma Kadka, who was the co-owner of RGS Nepali Market, they've since sold this business. She said, "I just want to do what the people needs. These people are like starving. You know, sometimes even me. If I like my country's food and if I don't get it, I feel like I'm starving. I try a lot of different foods, but I don't get full. They're not getting their food, but since I'm here, I'm helping them." Like countless Bhutanese Nepali people, Goma and her husband Ratna Kadka spent 20 years in a Nepali refugee camp after their expulsion from Bhutan in 1992. And they lived in limbo in this camp without opportunities for work or a future, despite being very educated. In 2010, they joined their families, some of whom had already settled here in Burlington. They opened the Nepali Dumpling House on North Street in 2015. And then in 2017, they grew out of that space, so they opened a much larger market in the former Marola's Market on North Avenue. And much to their surprise, at this new location, 95% of their customers are from African countries. So they had a lot to learn. And they asked their customers to teach them about the different foods so that they wanted. And there was a language barrier, so they used sign language. Sometimes their customers would bring in photographs. They might bring in somebody who spoke English to describe it. And so there was this huge amount of learning going on for Goma and Ratna. And then they would bring this information to markets in New York. Sometimes they brought back the wrong foods, but eventually they'd get it right. And since, as I said, since this project, the Kadkas have actually sold this market to another Bhutanese Nepali couple. And they have moved to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, where more of their family lives, and they've opened another market there. So it's in their blood. In 1922, Louis and Conchetta Parada Izo and their 5 children, Silvio, Alfonso, Mario, Francesca, and Filomena, traveled from their home in Civitavecchia, Italy, to Burlington, where Conchetta's brother Alfred Parada had settled about 10 years earlier. And when they arrived, they went into business with Alfred as Parada and Izo at 77 Pearl Street. All the Izo children worked in the market, and Conchetta provided some of the fruits and vegetables from her large backyard garden. The market carried Italian specialty foods as well as staples. In the early years, customers would scoop macaroni and crackers out of barrels. And people remember, one memory that comes up a lot is that people remember how the air was thick with the smell of Italian cheeses like mozzarella and ricotta and these balls of provolone cheese that were wrapped in wax and hanging from the ceiling. And they would drip this wax in the summer onto the counters. Cheeses and other specialty items like pepperoni, salami, mortadella, and sausage would arrive from Boston. So Mitch Allen, a Lebanese resident and customer, recalls, "My brother would talk about going in the Marola's store down the street, or Izo's, and just a variety of Italian cheeses. This all came from Italy, and they'd bring in big tubs of calamari around Christmas time. And he said you could blindfold him and take him in any store, and he could tell you where he was just from the smells, the cheeses, the cold-cut meats." So the importance of meat to the American diet and many other food traditions meant that the butcher or meat cutter was very important in a community in the first half of the 20th century. And customers often chose a market based on the butcher who could cut, grind, or trim the meat most skillfully for traditional recipes like Lebanese kibbeh or French-Canadian tourtière, or who could make the most savory sausage or grind the most flavorful hamburger. A funny thing when we were interviewing people was that everybody had their favorite market and said that market had the best butcher. So that, you know, they knew where to go for their meat. Now, the Danis family's arrival in Vermont was typical of many French Canadians seeking better job opportunities in America. Louis Danis, his wife Victorine, and their 8 children settled in Queen City Cotton Company housing in the Lakeside neighborhood around 1910. And over the next few decades, several members of that family worked in the mills. Arthur Danis opened the market in 1926, and it became a social center of the community. Over the years, there was a hall on the second floor of the store, and this was a billiard hall at one point. It was a school, it was a church, and it was the home of the St. John's Club, a French-Canadian fraternal organization that some of you may know of. Not to mention that there were graduation and wedding celebrations there, and it was also a youth club at some point. Arthur's family is in the left-hand photo here, and then Arthur's brother Dona on the right was the butcher, and he cleaned the meat from the pig's heads for head cheese, which is a jellied cold cut. He made boudin, or blood sausage, and he ground the meat for tourtières, a meat pie, and the ever-popular hamburg. In winter, his wife Beatrice made tourtières to sell in the store, and their daughter Val has carried on this tradition of making tourtières at holiday time. I think she told me that she makes 30-some of these, so a lot. She recalls, "My father would get up early, and being a good Catholic, he always said his prayers on his knees in front of the couch. His shoes were polished, and he wore a white shirt, and then he'd go to the store. He was the one who opened the store in the morning and put on his white apron, rolled up his sleeves, and then that was the beginning of the day there." Georgie George's family hailed from a small village in Mount Lebanon, a district of Greater Syria until Lebanon won independence in 1943. And like many new arrivals, his father, Daniel, worked in a mill to save enough money so he could open a market, which he did in 1920 with his wife, Reme. And after taking over the business, Georgie leased what had been another Izo's market space at 38 Pearl Street, and he operated it with his wife, Isabel. Georgie is in the left-hand photo. He's the man standing on the left, on the far left there. It was hard to find photos of him. So the Izo brothers and their families lived in apartments above the market. So this whole block was like one big family home. And Mario Izo's wife, Jeanette, operated a beauty salon above the market, adding foot traffic to what was a busy street corner. And she's in this central middle photograph. She's pictured on the left with a friend. So in 1962, urban renewal leveled much of this neighborhood, including George's Market. There's now housing there. Customers said that Georgie George ground the leanest, freshest beef for kibbeh, a Lebanese dish. This is made with ground beef or lamb, bulgur, onions, and spices, and it is traditionally eaten raw, so fresh, lean meat was very important. Monica Simon Farrington, a Lebanese customer, remembers he'd go behind his counter into this walk-in freezer and come out carrying this humongous leg of beef. He'd flop it onto this big wooden cutting block and sharpen his knives. His trick was to grind it twice, and it was so tender, it was unbelievable. Interesting note on that, Monica is now a vegetarian, so she makes kibbeh with Beyond Beef, and she says it's quite good. So meat is certainly a part of more recent immigrant diets as well, but vegetables and fruits feature prominently. And market customers, we were told that market customers care a lot about the source of their food. So owners will spend a lot of time looking for products that come from a certain place. For example, African customers at RGS Nepali like dried fish that comes from specific familiar locations that they are familiar with. And Halal Champlain Market, customers prefer the flavor of free-range halal meat that's sourced from Australia. So the owners butcher the meat in a small back room of that market, and people will walk away carrying large plastic bags of chicken, lamb, beef, goat, and camel meat. Vermont-based Green Mountain Cassava supplies many markets with cassava in its many forms. Entrepreneurs like Eddie Abenedo, the company's founder, are filling a gap by growing or sourcing foods that are essential to the different cultural cuisine, and cassava in particular is consumed by both Latin America, African countries, as well as Asia. Markets are often the center of the social and civic life of the community, and customers will arrive and linger to pass the time. In the first half of the 20th century, residential and commercial life mingled in city centers, and some of these markets were designated they were polling places, or you went there to register to vote, and they also hosted civic meetings. Arthur Martel and Octave Lavalley, their market is pictured on the left there. They were probate commissioners, and so they would always have their meetings at their store. And the article on the right, you probably can't, well, maybe you can see it. Every single polling place listed there is a market. So it just goes to show you how important they were in these communities. Like many immigrants, French-Canadian Edward Roy, who is in the left-hand photo pictured to the right, the shorter man, juggled several jobs to support his wife Laura and their 7 children. At various times between 1903 and 1923, he was a weaver at the American Woolen Mill, he was a clerk at a local market, and he was a milk dealer. He and his wife, Laura, purchased the Weaver Street Market in 1923, and they raised their kids in a room behind the market and then rooms upstairs. And when he died in 1954, 3 of his 7 children, Emile, Irene, and Bernard, shared management of the market. And Emile was the meat cutter, Bernard handled the deliveries and advertising, and Irene clerked and did the books. Emile's son, Larry, said, "Our store was a hub of activity. We had a couple of guys that would come in every day, and they would go into the cooler and grab their beer and sneak around the corner so they could talk to my father, and they would sip on their bottle of beer. The mailmen would come in, and they would buy stuff, open up a jar of sausage or a jar of pickled eggs, and then leave it hidden there on a shelf until they could come back. Us young kids would go in there and talk with them, and they always had a lot to say." Chick DuPont, whose family emigrated from Quebec to Vermont in 1905, he left school after the 8th grade to help support his family as a weaver at the American Woolen Mill. In 1945, he opened his own market at 60 Hickok Street, and from there he presided over the daily comings and goings of residents of the Flats, which was the neighborhood closest to the mills on the flat section of the city, right along the Winooski River. Chick was active in local politics. He was actually mayor for 8 years, and one Winooski resident recalls, "There were always men gathered at the oil stove in the store, sharing stories and talking politics. All opinions were welcome." Today, owners Sonny and Pam Vizina call themselves curators of this community market. Chick was beloved by the neighborhood children who played hopscotch and jacks out front on the sidewalk, and the store was home base for games of hide and seek. Many children would love to run errands for their mother, and they would stop in to pick up groceries and return home to find penny candy at the bottom of the bag. He would keep his eye on children while their mothers were running errands, and he proudly displayed school pictures behind the counter. So today, some customers live farther away from their markets in neighborhoods or suburbs with available housing, and they may shop less often, and they might arrive by bus or car now. But for immigrants and refugees, the personal connection at small markets remains a very important part of their lives. The daughter of Ahmed Aref, who is the manager of Nada International Market in Winooski, says, "It's something that reminds customers of home when they come in and see some products in Arabic. It just helps them find their culture, and they know that they belong somewhere, maybe even if it's a small supermarket." Moisa Matume arrived in the US in 2000 at the age of 19 from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and he joined a brother of his who was already living in Worcester, Massachusetts, where there are several wholesalers who supply restaurants and markets with global foods. In 2007, he moved to Vermont, and he worked as a vendor for one of these wholesale businesses before he opened his own market in 2020. And one of his first steady customers was RGS Nepali Market, when the Khadkas were just beginning to learn about African foods. So he was one of their teachers. He says, "I want my customers to feel home, and I can tell if they're speaking French or Swahili or Lingala, then I'll catch up from there because I speak all those languages, and make them feel at home where they can do a shopping as if they were doing it back home." Between 1993 and 2005, about 1,700 Bosnians settled in Vermont due to the Bosnian War. Dato Vujanovic left his home near Sarajevo in 1998 with his parents and his wife, and he settled in Vermont through the Vermont Refugee Resettlement Program. He had been a student in Bosnia before he left, but when he arrived here, he spent several years working for Rhino Foods before opening his own market in 2004. As I said, this market serves an Eastern European clientele. One of the market's regular customers, Vladimir Selek, said, "Usually you meet some people from your country. Not everybody have time now to meet. I guess they may meet home or parties. You come here, you can speak your own language, which is nice, so it's a piece of home." Dato is on the left in that photo on the left there. So customer service in local markets is more than a business transaction. Many market owners are and were community leaders. They mentor children, help the elderly and the housebound, provide rides to those without cars, and they deliver food. Customers might reach out to a market owner for help navigating an unfamiliar bureaucracy in this country, whether that's completing legal papers or paying a parking ticket or finding work or housing. This Epstein and Melnick ad I thought was really interesting. It's a handbill from 1921, and it says at the bottom, "This is not a chain store. This store has been a service store for the past 17 years. I thought it was really interesting that back in 1921, there was already the shadow of chains on the horizon, and they were making sure that they distinguished themselves. The families of John and Mildred McLaurin were part of the Great Migration of African Americans who left the South between about 1915 into the 1970s. For better economic and education opportunities and to escape racial violence. In 1965, John moved his family from Queens up to Burlington to take a job as the mail order foreman for a clothing company here. He purchased Rome's groceries from Morris and Shirley Rome in 1975. That was a Jewish-owned market. The Rome family had owned it since 1924. They had constructed that building. Along with that building also included rental units. So they were thinking ahead of additional income for themselves. In the early years, Mildred McLaurin managed the store because John was working part-time jobs to make ends meet. So over the years, his investment in rental properties in Burlington strengthened the family's financial situation, but it also opened his eyes to the problem of homelessness in the city. So he would provide rooms or apartments, he was investing in real estate, for little or no rent to people who were facing homelessness. In 2005, he received the Neighborhood Improvement Award for his work to provide, quote, stability and hope, unquote, for people. His daughter Judy, who actually now still owns the store, says, "My father was very helpful. Anyone that needed it, he would do his best to help out. He always told us to be kind to the less fortunate because there was a very thin line between them and us. At any given time, we can be in that position, and what you put out, you will get back." Abdi Nur Hassan and his family arrived in Syracuse in 2006 after spending years in a Kenyan refugee camp. In 2007, they moved to Burlington, and by 2008, they had purchased a store from another Somali refugee. This market used to be called Community Halal Market, and we thought very much the spirit of that former name continues at this market. It is very much a social place. Ahmed Omar, a customer, and the owner of the Somali-owned restaurant Kismayo Kitchen says, "Abdi, he spends hours and hours to help his community. You can go there if you have a letter, if you don't speak English, he can translate for you. Send your applications." When I look at him, I think, wow, this guy is something else. He's doing an amazing job for his community. Market proprietors were in a unique position to identify customers who were struggling to make ends meet. Extending credit was one way they could help, and sometimes that meant forgiving debt entirely, and many, many markets at this time did this. So whether saving bologna ends for children or discreetly adding extra items to a grocery bag or dropping off a box of staples to a hungry household, these owners supported the welfare of the community. Lou Izo, who is the grandson of Louis and Conchetta, the founders of Izo's Market, recalls the informal credit system at his family's market. You didn't have to go through a credit check to get the food. A little slip was made. It was all done discreetly, and my father, my uncles knew who needed the credit. The slip would be put on a nail, not too sophisticated an accounting system. And eventually, when the person could pay, they would come back, and it was a trust system. Lou also told us that at the end of the year, if the debt had not been paid, they just threw them all away and started over. Mitch Allen remembers George's Market as a second home. He and his friends would stop in here to buy peas and pea shooters for neighborhood games, or maybe a Coke to drink while listening to the grown-ups. Remembering Georgie, Mitch says, everybody who walked in the store would visit with him, and he made a good neighborhood center point. All the salesmen would come in and visit. They'd be talking about all kinds of community things and activities. As a kid, it was good to listen to, and they were good role models. The photos here, Georgie's in the center there. We don't know who those teenagers are, but kind of gives you a feel for how comfortable kids were with him. Bottom center is Mitch as a boy, 12 maybe? I don't know. How old do you think you were? 10 or 12. And then the upper right is some of the neighborhood children, including Lou Izo sitting down on a chair in the front left and Mitch in the back right. And I think several of those other children are Izos as well. So it just gives you a feel for how the kids kind of roamed the neighborhood together. Family is the heart of many small markets. Generations will pitch in on tasks required to feed the community. ordering and picking up food, stocking shelves, butchering, clerking, accounting, legal paperwork. There's lots to do. Many family-owned markets treat customers like family too, so they share time inside and outside the business. On the left here is Ratna and Goma Kadka with their son Sohan in the center, and Sayel on the right, and Sayel's friend Emmanuel sitting to the left with the big grin. He considers himself part of the family, so he's in the photo. And the bottom center photo is a backyard picnic, and I think Izo's and maybe Allen's are in this photo, as well as I expect other French-Canadian and Italian families. And then on the top right is the 3 generations of the Kieslich family. Albert is the son of J.V. Kieslich, the founder, and his children, Dick and Jim, are to either side, and Jeff, his grandson, is the little boy. So a great example of multi-generational market operation. Isaka Kunta, a customer at RGS Nepali Market, speaks to this idea of the market family. He said, "As soon as I get into the door, they say, 'Oh, where you been?' This mean they looking for me and they care about me. And it's nowhere, no place that you can go, and people care about you just for shopping. So I love them. They are my brother and sister." Ahmed Aref's extended family owned a very large, successful market in Baghdad, Iraq. And in about 2005, the family in the market was targeted as a symbol of the wealthy class, and the entire extended family was in danger. Ahmed's father moved the family to Amman, Jordan in 2005, and he opened another market there. And then in 2009, they followed family that was already settled in this area and to Vermont, and his father opened yet another market. His daughter says of this tradition and her father, "This store is more than a way to make money to live. It's our background and our history and keeping the tradition going by having a supermarket. But first thing is that he loves this job. It's his passion. It's what he grew up to do and what he got from his father, so it's not easy to let go." This is her father and her in this left-hand photo, and then the man on the right is Thamer, is his uncle. So, and he worked in the store in Baghdad as well. All of them did. Mayer and Minnie Epstein immigrated from Russia to the United States around 1900. First, they joined family in Mount Pleasant, Pennsylvania, and then they moved to Burlington, where Minnie's brother, Samuel Melnick, lived. So the Jewish community was very closely intertwined in those days, and marriages often happened between families from the same shtetls or villages in Eastern Europe. So Mayer's job when he got there was a clerk at Sager's Grocery and Department Store on North Avenue, and that was where Samuel, his brother-in-law, was working. And the family lived upstairs in an apartment. Eventually, Mayer and Sam opened their own market in 1910 at 27 Main Street in Winooski. And all 5 Epstein children, Louis, Sam, John, Eva, and Sophia, worked at the store, and they lived in the apartments upstairs off and on until the store closed. Mayer and Minnie's grandchildren, Meryl and Judy, fondly recall spending Sunday afternoons upstairs with their aunts while their father Sam was doing inventory, and then they would go out for a Sunday drive. Sadly, like George's Market and many others in traditional immigrant neighborhoods, this market was a casualty of urban renewal. The Kieslicks were a prominent family of craftsmen and contractors in Burlington's thriving German community in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And despite this family tradition, John, or J.V. Kieslick, gravitated to the food business. In 1911, he opened a small grocery store at 18 Ward Street, and then in 1914, he opened a much larger market at 203 North Avenue. It had a very spacious apartment upstairs where his family lived, his wife Marie and sons Albert, Arthur, and John F. And his sons all clerked there into the 1950s. And when he passed away, his son Albert and grandson Dick took over the business until it was sold in 1983. And in these photos, on the left-hand large family photo, this is his second wife, Gertrude. His wife, Marie, passed away. There's the three boys. And notice he's wearing butcher cuffs to keep his lower arms from being cut when he's slicing and butchering meat. And then this is Albert on the right at the meat counter. His sister Marie Kieslick, JV's granddaughter, was part of the family work crew, and she said in the fall, everybody would get together and make the sauerkraut. As children, we all had little tasks to do. You had to cut all that cabbage, and then the spices, the vinegar, and by the end of the day, the barrels were already in the cellar, filled with their ingredients, and then sealed because sauerkraut ferments. Market ownership offers a path to economic independence and security for newly arrived families. Owners will often work long hours, juggling 2 jobs if need be to create a better life for themselves and their families. Early market owners worked second jobs in textile and lumber mills and other industries. I talked a little bit about that. Today, many owners work late shifts in service or manufacturing businesses so that they can be in the market during business hours, so not very much sleep. John and Huang Tran and their children arrived in 1994 after years in a refugee camp. And in their village of Bien Ho in Vietnam, they had grown rice, fruit, and coffee. So it was a natural step for them to purchase a market from another Vietnamese immigrant in 2007. And despite 15 years in the business, the family continues to work very long hours. Every Tuesday, John and Huang leave about 3 in the morning to drive down to the Chelsea Market in Boston to buy supplies that items that their supplier can't find for them. And in addition to managing the market, their oldest son, Anthony, also operates Saigon Kitchen, a restaurant a block away. He puts in probably 14 to 16 hours a day in order to provide a future for his daughters. His daughters are pictured in this poster in that photo, the poster on the door. It's announcing the opening of his new restaurant. He says, "I need to think for my children's future too. I don't expect my children, they need to do everything what I already done. If they want to continue the work I already done, they continue. But if they don't want it, they have their own choice. I want them better than me, and I want them to do something different." So the stories of these markets, established by immigrants and refugees, embody timeless values of hard work, resourcefulness, resilience, and commitment to family and community. These are values that bind across time and cultures. Dado Vojanovic says, "I wish people would understand how hard immigrants work. I came to this country with no English and $45, and now I have a successful business. And that's because I worked, and I pay my property taxes and my school taxes. And this is what my life is like." If you're interested in learning more, there is a web app at morethan-a-market.org. There's a lot more information about these markets, lots more stories. It was really hard trying to figure out what stories to tell, and I got different ones for the walking tour that we had and also for the exhibit, but that's a place to go to hear more voices. The exhibit is actually open at the Old North End Community Center through May of next year. So I encourage you to go there. It's open weekdays only and not on Thursdays. And if you want to reach me, my contact information is here. Thank you.